Welcome back for this final Samhain installment of Hal-LEE-ween. So let's just jump straight in, for we have much to discuss and so little time before the end of the month. 1970 sees Jess Franco's Count Dracula. Remember the rules at the start of the month, we're not going to be discussing Hammer. Christopher Lee, as per the title of this video, made a multitude of films in which he appeared as Count Dracula that were not Hammer films. He constantly complained about the lack of Stoker in the Hammer films, which was a little bit hypocritical because even that first film, there was hardly any Stoker really. A lot of it was changed. Even if there was Stoker involvement in the slight bits of dialogue, a lot of the actual plot was changed anyway. So, yeah, not a very valid complaint, Chris. Sorry about that. However, in 1970, he makes three films starring as Dracula. Taste the Blood of Dracula for Hammer, Scars of Dracula for Hammer, and this Euro film with Jess Franco. Jess Franco and he had struck up a friendship making the last two Fu Manchu films of the five that Christopher Lee made, and decided between them we should do a faithful version of Dracula. No one's really done that before. It's always been some kind of twist. So let's do a faithful Stoker version. So they do. Don't need to go into the plot of it because it's Bram Stoker's Dracula. You all know that. Jonathan Harker, young estate agent, goes to Transylvania, is held hostage, blah, blah, blah. Done to death. So you don't need to need me to go into it. What this adds to the canon is just certain things that hadn't been depicted on screen before, like Dracula de-aging the more he sups. So the more he feeds on his victims, the more he regains his youth. He starts as a white-haired man with a moustache, very pale-skinned, ends up with jet black hair and a black moustache and olive skin. So he's regaining his youth, his vigor. It also adds a lot of the kind of teleportation that Dracula's capable of in the novels, where he turns into mist. Here, that's done with a rather hokey effect, but hey, Franco was never noted for his special effects work. And then, side things to go into include just the way he portrays Dracula. So in the Hammer films, he's pretty much a feral animal for most of them. After the initial scene, first 20 minutes of the first Dracula, he's pretty much a feral animal from then on. But you can see why that would get slightly dull to just come back to play that quite a few times. But here, in that initial scene with Jonathan Harker, there's a wonderful part, and it's straight from Stoker, where Dracula is talking about the history of his family, the history of the Draculas, and he's retelling it. And Jonathan Harker feels like he's kind of telling me this as someone who was there rather than someone who's just telling me his family history. He's so passionate about it, it feels like he was actually there. Of course he was, for this is the original Vlad Dracula. And Christopher Lee obviously reads that and it sticks in his mind because that's exactly how he plays it. He gives it this wistful reminiscence about how he was there when the Turks crossed the fields and we defeated them at this battle, blah blah blah. So he adds that wonderful historic involvement, but also a kind of sadness that times have changed. So he talks about the rise of the houses of Europe, the Romanovs and the like, Saxe-Coburgs. And again, you get the impression that he's been there to witness their rise as his family dynasty has fallen over the centuries. So it's just a very clever way of playing it from Christopher Lee, where he's not giving a history lesson. He's giving a hint that it's his own personal history. It's just wonderful stuff. The film's almost worth it for that alone. There's a lot in the film where, if you're a horror hound and you've seen a lot of Dracula films, there's a good chance you'll be disappointed by this. Because the major problem with Stoker's novel and it's not a problem with the actual novel, but it's a problem with trying to adapt a faithful version of the novel, is that Dracula pretty much goes missing after the first scene, and he's just a kind of presence that's talked about. So if you think of Bela Lugosi's Dracula, popping up at the theatre and the likes, that's all invention. If you think about Gary Oldman's Dracula, seeing the reincarnation of his lost love and following her through London, that's all invention. These weren't inventions to keep Dracula in the film during the middle part where, well, we can't just have Dracula not on screen for an hour. Well, this, deciding to be faithful, does do that. And it does suffer for that, unfortunately. Partially because just the nature of the beast, you want to see Count Dracula in a Count Dracula production, but also partially because Franco's just not a good enough director to keep the drama tight and to make the other characters interesting. There's a sense that, well, if we're going to keep Dracula faithful, everything else should be too. And a lot of the other characters, they have internal ideas and monologues, which aren't expressed, of course, being internal, but without having something like those ideas and feelings expressed out loud, a lot of the characters just come off as flat. Van Helsing's a perfect example of that. Herbert Lom, the great Herbert Lom, plays Van Helsing here, and he's very tedious. He's very dull, because a lot of what Van Helsing thinks and does, he relays in a wax cylinder. But there's no scene of that in this picture. So Van Helsing, therefore, comes off as very flat. It's just not ideal. There's some nice visual parts. They were going to film it in Czechoslovakia, but were rebuffed. Ended up having to film it in Barcelona and Alicante. So you don't quite get the ancient stone castles and things, but you do get a slightly more Spanish version of the tale, with very obviously Spanish looking villas and whatnot in the background, which, depending on your point of view, could detract from it. I think it adds a slightly unique tone to it, in a movement of film, the Dracula films, which has been, you know, oversaturated. It's nice to have something a bit unique. Special mention for Klaus Kinski, who plays Renfield. He basically just plays Klaus Kinski locked in a room because he goes bonkers for 93% of the time he's on screen. But again, perfect example. Renfield in the novel, he's already gone mad by the time the novel starts as Dracula's previous victim, and there's no prologue here. It works in the novel, but this is just a perfect example of saying just because it works on the page doesn't mean it works as a film. Maybe there's a reason why so few versions have been so strict in adapting Bram Stoker. Now, to me, if you want a version of Dracula which sticks to Bram Stoker, go for the BBC version with Louis Jourdan from 1977. It is 10 times the film of that, and even though it too has things that, yeah, on paper should suffer because of the adaptation and trying to stick more rigidly to Bram Stoker, it's got much more visual flair. They use a lot more effects and whatnot, but never in a silly way or an over the top way. So it just gives you a little bit more flair on screen rather than feel like, "Well, this is a bit of a chore." But I'm sure for Francophiles, they find that one a little bit more interesting than I do. So there we go. From the not quite sublime to the rather ridiculous. 1976's Dracula and Son with Christopher Lee and Bernard Menez. This is an interesting one because it's a comedy. It is, trust me, it's a comedy made in 76, but an English dub is done later and it comes out in 79 in America. And you get two very different versions of the film. You get a French version and you get an American version with two completely different senses of humor. So you get the wry comedy in the French version. It's from the director of La Cage aux Folles, that great film that was remade as The Birdcage, wasn't it? In 19, '96. So it's from Edward Molinaro, and he hated what the Americans did to his film. It was American International who did it, who, yeah, they had form for destroying European productions, didn't they? Right back to the Roger Corman days. So the vague plot of the film is similar in both versions because the footage is the same. Um, Dracula gets this woman to be his bride, takes her in, and impregnates her. And Dracula has a son. The wife dies. Time goes by. Dracula raises his son, and there's a revolution in Romania. Transylvania's been taken over by soldiers, and Dracula and his son have to flee. They do so, end up getting separated due to farcical. I won't go into absolutely everything in this film because there's so much, especially with two versions. They get separated. One of them ends up in London. That's Christopher Lee as Dracula, and his son ends up Ferdinand. Although he's got different names, and he's either Ferdinand in the French version or Victor in the American version. Ends up in France, working the night shift in a mortuary. Right. Rather pleasingly, I think both versions are absolutely worth your time. This is one of those cases where, yes, it's butchered from the original intent, but I still like what they did with the butchery. I think there's some really clever jokes in both versions. There's definitely some annoying parts in the American version. So, an example of the jokes, again, like I said with Gremlins 2 the other day, talking about comedy, you end up just repeating the jokes. But Christopher Lee as Dracula lands in London and he's disoriented. A movie producer happens to be driving by and sees Christopher Lee walking around in full outfit and says, "Hey, he looks like Christopher Lee. We should see if he can act and make a vampire movie." It is Christopher Lee, obviously. So there's a very meta quality, and that's in the American dub, which is pretty funny. But then the downside of the American dub is the goofiness, where it goes a bit too over the top silly. So, for example, they do make a horror film starring the real Dracula as Christopher Lee playing Dracula. Very meta. Um, but when they do, they reuse the same bit of footage of him entering a set and asking to speak to Van Helsing. They reused that same bit of footage 5 times with a dubbed in voice saying, "Play this one like W.C. Fields, play this one like Jimmy Cagney." And the actor, whoever did the Christopher Lee voice for it, because it wasn't Chris Lee, just does impressions of Jimmy Cagney doing Dracula's dialogue and W.C. Fields and blah, 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 blah. And the joke wears a bit thin, and they reuse that same bit of footage of Dracula entering the parlor and asking to speak to Van Helsing. Not joking, maybe 20 times. So he ends up doing dentistry adverts and whatnot, advertising toothpaste because his fangs are pearly white. So there's a lot to commend the humor in it, I think. But again, there's a lot of downsides to the humor, where the son speaks in a very broad Brooklyn accent because, hey, if he talks like Groucho Marx, people will know it's a comedy. Not too sure. Again, the French version tones that down entirely, where it is more wry, observational comedy. But even that falls a bit flat in a lot of places, where there's more farcical parts where Dracula and son both fall in love with the same woman, and they're both vying for her affections and trying to sabotage each other's coffins so that the other one gets turned into dust at the break of dawn. I still think there's some really worthwhile comedy in both versions, though. Throughout, I think there's some really funny stuff, and honestly, I recommend this. Which I don't know if you've heard of Tender Dracula, which is the only time Peter Cushing played a vampire. It's terrible. This, although, yeah, a lot of the jokes will make you go, "Oh God." I think you'll laugh at more than a few. I did. I'm recommending this. And again, two quite different versions on the disc mean that if one of them doesn't work for you and the other one doesn't quite work for you, maybe together you'll still get the value of one of them working for you if you add the sum total together. So I don't know. I think having both presentations here is pretty solid. It's also got a great score by Vladimir Kozma, some great special features, and it looks terrific too. How funny though that Christopher Lee says, "I'm sick of doing these Hammer films. They're nothing like Bram Stoker," but he does this where Dracula advertises toothpaste. Mm. Methinks there was something else going on behind the relationships with him and the Carreras family who operated Hammer at the time, because this was not long after the satanic rites of Dracula. So oh, I hate doing these Dracula films. Well, what's that? Farcical French comedy starring Dracula? Yeah, but recommended. Again, if I can get versions of these films, I know I can get one of the ones I'm recommending today. I'll put them below. Otherwise, you'll need to settle for a trailer. Next up is 1974 In Search of Dracula. Now, I did mention we're doing the length and breadth of Chris's career, and you might think in this last episode, well, if you're doing three Draculas, they're all going to be quite similar, aren't they? No, because faithful version of Bram Stoker's novel, farcical comedy, documentary. This is a weird one because it feels like the kind of thing that would normally be a special feature or at least a bonus disc, because it's a little bit too good to just be a special feature, because it is a contemporary documentary from the 70s with Christopher Lee. Now, why I have included it this month isn't just to say, and he also hosted a documentary. So what? What makes it interesting is that if you think about those Hammer films, in a lot of them, Christopher Lee really is almost doing a silent performance because he doesn't speak in two or three of them at least. So what he brings to it is a silent ferocity. And in this film, right, he narrates it, he does the on-screen introductions, but there are dramatic reconstructions when he's talking about the novel or different versions. Christopher Lee plays Dracula in those dramatic scenes as well. So it's almost an unreleased, well, un-narrative version of Christopher Lee as Dracula. And he looks a bit like he did in Count Dracula with the white moustache. So clearly he said, we're going to do Stoker's version if I'm going to appear on screen as Dracula. But he looks great. He's got a real fire. You can tell he's excited to be educating and informing people about Stoker. But what makes it even more interesting is that this documentary goes into the history of Dracula. It goes back to Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracula. Christopher Lee plays Vlad Dracula as well. So there are scenes of him with the big Vlad the Impaler moustache and the helmet thing. We've all seen that famous picture of Vlad Dracula. He plays that figure from history in these dramatic scenes as well. So it's a fascinating film where we get, and it's not even just for a couple of minutes like he is in some of the Hammer films. There's at least 10, 15 minutes of him playing either Dracula or Vlad Tepes. He narrates the whole film and he introduces it on screen. The film does fall down in a few places. It starts to talk about the birth of the vampire in uh, literature, and it goes into John Polatoro's The Vampire, which was one of the stories devised that night at Via Diodati, where Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein. And because of the link to Frankenstein, the film spends about 10 minutes talking about Frankenstein and not Dracula. So that's a bit weird. And it goes into vampire bats. It shows you a rather extended sequence of a vampire bat eating, drinking the blood of a hamster, which is one of those. Why is this here? But it's part of that Mondo style of documentary where you won't see something like this at home. And that's the kind of feel of the whole documentary is. Yeah, this actually is. I can see why it's got its own Blu-ray, why it's got its own. So on paper, it sounds like the kind of thing you would just get on any old documentary about Dracula. You know, okay, so we'll go into a little bit of the cinematic side, then we'll go into the origins of the real life story, and that will do us home. But no, to have Christopher Lee as Dracula, again, exactly the same time period where he's saying, I don't want to play this character anymore for Hammer, they're getting him to play the character and to play the real life Vlad Tepes. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. So I recommend it just for that, if nothing else. Although I think there is quite a lot to commend it. Rather cannily, when it gets to the latter part of the film, you start to talk about how the Dracula story has come to be on screen. They talk about Bela Lugosi for a few moments, and then it says, and of course, Hammer Films also made their own versions. Moving on. So clearly, the people who made this said, we better not ask Chris to talk about Hammer. Yeah, cut those parts from the script. Ixnay on the Hammersnay. So there's one line about Hammer horror here, even though it's a history of Dracula on page, on stage, and on screen. They don't talk about Hammer for more than a sentence, so that's rather telling, isn't it? But again, the reason to recommend this is the history lesson of Vlad. It goes to Romania. We meet a lot of the he calls them the peasant folk. I mean, it was the 1970s and they were under Ceausescu, so the oppressed, more like it. It goes to Romania and we see the current day conditions, but we see the original Castle Dracula, which again we've seen in other documentaries now. But in '74, you weren't getting that kind of thing terribly often. And, to avoid repeating myself, just to see Chris Lee playing Dracula, but also Tepesh. Wonderful. What a treat. What an absolute treat. And he's clearly relishing it because he puts movement into his parts that he never did as Dracula. He puts ideas and looks. He's not phoning it in at all. He is clearly very excited to be doing this. And I think this is a bit of a hipster douchebag thing to say. Might be one of his better performances as Dracula because you can tell he's excited about it. So even though it's not an amazing documentary, just like Count Dracula, you can tell he likes it more because it's more Stoker. And he's putting more into the performances in those two, even though I don't personally think they're anywhere near as good as Jimmy Sangster's Dracula, directed by Terence Fisher. Doesn't matter, Chris did, and you can tell that. He's an actor who kind of lets you know with his eyes, with his intensity, with the way he carries himself, what he thinks, and he thinks these are better than the Hammer films. So there you go, that is three non-Hammer performances by Christopher Lee as Dracula. That takes us to 30. It's 31 days and he didn't play Dracula another time. So I'll need to throw in, well, while we're here, another vampire movie just to make it a quartet. Crypt of the Vampire from 1964. He was a busy bee in 1964, old Chris. I feel like half the films we've covered this month were from 1964. The reason I'm recommending this is most of you, or some of you at least, certainly, will be familiar with the Karnstein films. I covered them all last year during Halloween, where I covered 31 non-Dracula Hammer films. So the Karnstein films with Camilla Karnstein, Count Karnstein, etc. This is one of those that came out 6 years before Hammer started doing them. Don't need to go into much of the plot on it. It's got another name I can't remember right off the top of my head, but Count Karnstein essentially sends for a doctor to look after his sick daughter Laura, whose nurse believes that she's being possessed by the spirit of Carmela Karnstein, an evil relative, an evil descendant who was tortured and killed by local villagers but swore vengeance. Again, we've heard this kind of thing quite a bit during the month, haven't we? A young woman has an incident where her carriage collapses and kind of breaks down outside the Karnstein residence. and she's invited to stay, while repairs are being made, and she befriends young Laura, and they have a very close relationship. However, something happens where the spirit of Camilla Karnstein is involved and has returned. There's a painting in this castle somewhere, and I don't need to go into all the side characters, but one character in particular realizes there are paintings underneath these paintings, and one of them has the face of the original Camilla Karnstein. And I believe that face is the face of whoever is committing murders in the local area. Hmm. I'm going to leave it there because this is definitely one of the films that I can link to below. This is fantastic. This is a real underseen gem. So again, not going to go any further because I can literally link to it and you can watch it, but I'll talk around it. The Karnstein films famously introduce from Sheridan Le Fanu's novel Carmilla from the 1800s before Dracula introduced the slight well, they were lesbian undertones in the novel. They become slightly more overt here, where they're clearly more than friends, and in Hammer they are just lesbian vampires. So Hammer were not holding back. This film, 1964, does hold back a little bit, but you can clearly see that they're going for a little bit more than insinuation. They are extremely friendly. It's got wonderful mood, wonderful atmosphere. It's terrifically directed by Camillo Mastroianni. It was originally going to be directed by Antonio Margheriti, the great exploitation director, but that fell through. And I think it's just an absolute gem of a little film, which, a bit like a couple of films that I've talked about in the last couple of videos, on the face of it, if you read the plot synopsis, you'll think, kind of seen that, kind of seen that. But believe me, it's just really well done and it's absolutely worth your time. It's only, an hour and 20 minutes, so it's 100% worth your time. If you've seen Carl Dreyer's Vampire, Roger Vadim's Blood and Roses, the Hammer Karnstein trilogy, you know roughly what to expect in terms of tone or if you've read the bloody novel by Sheridan Le Fanu. But what you get here is someone who's clearly in Camillo Mastroianni, along with the cinematographer, which was Julio Ortega, have clearly thought, okay, so Mario Bava's about now. What we should do is try and bring a kind of Bava-esque quality to this novel, which isn't as salacious as a straight vampire story, but there's a vampire spirit in it, there's a murder mystery in it, and we've got Christopher Lee to play Count Karnstein. So is he just a nobleman worried about his daughter? Well, he's perfect to have a red herring if we need one, but also if he is going to be the killer, he's also perfect if we decide to go that route. So I won't go any further with the plot synopsis or even really the review, but it's just perfect for it. Absolutely perfect. I think this is just an absolute underseen gem of a film. Can't recommend it highly enough. And once more, please check below and you'll be able to watch it for yourself and come back and let me know. There we go. That is 31 Christopher Lee films reviewed in exactly well, not quite as I record it because I'm taping on the 30th, but as I upload it in 31 days. So last year, 31 Hammer films in 31 days. This year, 31 Christopher Lee films and not touching a single Hammer in 31 days. How the hell can I top these next year? Folks, thank you very much. I know not everyone who subscribed happens to be a horror fan or happens to be an old school horror fan. So it's not for everyone, but hey, it's for some and it's for me. So if you are someone who's enjoyed it, thank you very much for coming along with me on the journey. I hope you found a few new films to try out. Again, I've tried to link to the available ones where possible. And I hope you found a few new favorites that have perhaps given you a little bit of a broader appreciation of Christopher Lee's career. That he wasn't just, this typecast actor. He was able to stretch his wings quite a little bit. So yeah, he never said no to much, but I'm glad he didn't because we got some rather interesting little oddities along the way, didn't we? Well, folks, once again, I can't stress how much I appreciate your patience over the month. I'll be back with a video probably next weekend now. I'll take a few days off from making a video. And next weekend, so what, that'll be November the 8th or 9th, I'll get a video up about future plans for the channel, how you can get involved, and yeah, all that good stuff. So, thank you very much. And after watching 31 Christopher Lee films of varying quality and varying levels of horror, from Western, documentary, to out and out Gothic, try not to have nightmares. Whether that's because the films were bad or the films are scary, well, that's up to you to decide. I'll see you next week.